Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar today, Cost-Benefit Analysis with John Stapleton. My name is Alison Mullen. I'm the Manager of Communications and Marketing at Essential Skills Ontario. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a few instructions. At the right-hand side of your screen is your dashboard. There you can ask questions in the question pane. And if it's a technical question, I'll try to answer it and assist you. If it's a question pertaining to the topic, feel free to ask at any time, and John will address them at the end of the webinar during the question and answer session. And if you'd like to participate on Twitter, just use the hashtag ESOWeb to share your thoughts and ideas. So now to introduce our presenter. John Stapleton worked for the Ontario government in the Ministry of Community and Social Services and his predecessors for 28 years in the area of social assistance and policy operations. His more recent government work concerned the implementation of the National Child Benefit. He is a commissioner with the Ontario Soldiers' Aid Commission and is a volunteer with St. Christopher House and Wood Green Community Services. John was research director for the Task Force on Modernizing Income Security for Working Age Adults in Ontario and was the co-chair of the working group associated with this project. He has undertaken an innovation fellowship with the Metcalf Foundation, and he teaches public policy and is a member of the 25 and 5. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to John.
Okay, thanks very much, Allison. And today we're going to talk about cost-benefit analysis, and we're going to use the example of programs for ex-offenders because often people can be a bit, ambivalent about programs for ex-offenders, and as a result is a really good example of what cost-benefit analysis really is. I'm not going to tell you how to do cost-benefit analysis. That is quite a that's quite a daunting task, and your math skills have to be fairly high to do it. I know that from the 2 cost-benefit analyses that I've conducted over the last 3 years, and I definitely had to get people with their black belts in Excel and things like that to assist, and people like that are very much needed as part of that process. But anyways, let's get right into it. Usually the cartoons about cost-benefit, risk-benefit analysis take ordinary relationships and then subject them to talk about the cost-benefit analysis, and most of the humor goes that direction. This one, the risk-benefit analysis says no, the cost-benefit analysis says maybe, and my gut feeling says go for it, and those sorts of things. It's like contrasting a cost-benefit analysis to what everybody knows in their heart to be right, and that's and we'll get into that a bit. So the contents today, as part 1 is an introduction, is what cost-benefit analysis actually does, and we'll talk about good cost-benefit analysis. Part of that, who accepts it, who rejects it, and conceiving cost-benefit in the public interest. And you'll soon see that people do business cases, but cost-benefit analysis has a higher test than a business case, and we'll see that in the example that we use. And you'll be able then to distinguish between what a good risk-benefit or business case analysis is versus a cost-benefit analysis, which is different. And we'll talk about findings and the importance of narrative, and that is where I'll be talking to you just about the whole idea of how to orchestrate a cost-benefit analysis, which I think is going to be more important to you than actually thinking about how to do one, unless you're mathematically inclined and have those skills and can get into discount rates and probability analysis and that sort of thing. You have good knowledge of the tax system, et cetera, et cetera. So away we go. Cost-benefit analysis. What many people think is cost-benefit is not true cost-benefit analysis at all. We tend to bandy around the term. What they're often meaning are studies that show that it is simply less costly in the short, medium, and longer term to provide one intervention over another. One of the classics, of course, is if we were just to provide housing to the homeless, it would be much cheaper. People talk about the $1 Million Murrays of the world from Malcolm Gladwell's article in the New Yorker back in 2006. And is that why don't we spend money on doing things that are cheaper? Well, that's not a cost-benefit analysis on its own, and you'll see why in a bit. So is it a slam dunk? Sometimes if you look at the data, cost-benefit conclusions often appear to be a slam dunk, which is a basketball term for an easy basket. You'll get one intervention is cheaper, safer, prevents undesirable side effects like housing for the homeless. But often what we do is we do a cost-benefit analysis after cost-benefit analysis, and they often appear to be redundant, and because they just line up alongside each other, and all the other cost-benefit analysis. For anybody who knows the English philosopher Ludwig von Wittgenstein, I guess it's just no von in there, Ludwig Wittgenstein, he said that if you want to convince yourself of something being true that you read in the paper and you're skeptical, all you have to do is go out and buy yourself 50 more copies of the same paper, and then you'll really be convinced. And he was kidding about the whole idea. But we, especially in the area of homelessness and housing, we have a plethora of cost-benefit analysis, and yet it doesn't necessarily change government's view as to whether they'll do that, and we'll learn why in a couple of minutes here. So here's the relationships again, and the kidding. I had my accounting department run a cost-benefit analysis on you, and I have some bad news. This sort of thing you see all the time in the cartoons on cost-benefit analysis. And cartoons are very interesting because they tell us often what we ourselves, how we kid about something, what we see as the underside of a particular issue. So in cost-benefit analysis is no exception. So what cost-benefit analysis is all about, it's a term that refers both to helping to appraise or assess, that is the case for a project or proposal, and which itself is a process known as project appraisal, and an informal approach to making economic decisions of any kind. So it can be, it's either a project or a case for a project appraisal, and of course there's something called a planning fallacy, and the planning fallacy, of course, is when you say that you're going to be able to put a program in place in 6 months, or you're going to be able to get rid of coal-fired generators in 3 or 4 years. So often what we get is aspirational policy, which says if everything just went perfectly, then we would, of course, something would cost very little, and it wouldn't take very long to do it, but of course life gets in the way, and cost-benefit analysis is there to try and give a bit of reality therapy to the idea or counteract the planning fallacy, which tends to be aspirational as opposed to realistic. So the cost-benefit analysis, and this is probably the key learning right here, it must always demonstrate that all stakeholders benefit, and that's a pretty tall order. A business case doesn't need to do that. So it's not just about doing things cheaper and better, and cost-benefit analysis is conducted on matters of public policy, and in order to be successful, must also show that the conclusions are supported by the public and are publicly acceptable. And of course, when we get to housing for the homeless, it's not necessarily publicly acceptable because the housing has to be somewhere, and it's going to be near someone who may not want that. You get the NIMBY effect, and you'll also get the effects that people may feel that that providing housing to the homeless, for example, is giving something to somebody that they don't otherwise deserve. And so you're not going to have all stakeholders on board in terms of the public, and that's often the reason we don't get it. So cost-benefit analysis, to be successful, must show that the conclusions are supported by the public. And the only real route to public acceptance is to demonstrate that a public policy and intervention performs a service or function from which all society can benefit. So if you talk about housing for the homeless, you got to say, why is that good for me? Why is that good for you? Why is it good for the person across the street and the person across the room? And of course, you get some of that. For those of you who have read The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, you'll know that they talk about why having greater equality is good for all of us. And they start to get some traction because they're not just talking about the person to which the intervention would apply. So let's talk about the Ford Pinto case. And the Ford Pinto case, if you go into Wikipedia, I guess in some ways I stole a lot of that from Wikipedia. It's really, but it's a celebrated case, and it's very, very public. And there are many actions that can be taken that are cost-effective, but maybe better for a company or a government, but are neither publicly acceptable nor have a benefit for the public at large. So the most famous example is in the literature is the Ford Motor Company and the problem it has that its automobile, the Ford Pinto. Many of you will remember the Ford Pinto. May it rest in peace. And because of design flaws, the Pinto was liable to burst into flames in a rear impact collision. And the Ford company's decision was not to issue a recall. Ford did something called a cost-benefit analysis. Now remember, the cost-benefit analysis, theirs was flawed because it didn't include all stakeholders. But they had estimated that based on the number of cars in use and the probable accident rate, deaths due to the design flaw would run about 50 million. And the amount Ford would have to pay out to settle wrongful death lawsuits. So that's a cost-benefit analysis in that sense, in that very narrow sense, but really is a business case because the cost-benefit analysis, again, I keep hammering it home, has to take into account all stakeholders. So this was estimated to be less than the cost of issuing a recall, which was 137.5 million. So they chose to, and this is often called a risk assessment to a risk analysis. But Ford overlooked or considered insignificant the cost of the negative publicity. And that turned out to be quite significant because it led to the recall anyways and to measurable losses in sales. And of course, in the cost-benefit analysis, the cheaper and better solution for Ford was to avoid the recall, pay out damages. Cost-benefit analysis supported Ford, but was better or cheaper only concerned what would possibly be better or cheaper for Ford. And that's what makes it a business case, because you do a business case, you're doing your company against other companies, and you know, Ford versus GM, etc. You're not talking about all public stakeholders. Someone unknowingly driving a Ford Pinto with a faulty gas tank would not agree with the conclusion of the cost-benefit analysis completed for Ford. They're going to die. So the fundamental issue here is on whose behalf the cost-benefit analysis is being completed. The CBA, and I'll call it CBA from now on, and it's often, if you talk to people in the U.S., they'll talk about CBAs because they always shorten everything in their talk. But the CBA conducted for potential victims of a faulty gas tank looks very, very, very different from one conducted by Ford, because here the stakeholder would be the person who's about to die when the car blows up. So let's move over to ex-offenders and work through what we're talking about with cost-benefit analysis, its rules and what it is and isn't looking at ex-offenders. And it's especially intractable when it comes to phrases like helping ex-offenders, because the framing makes the assumption as to who and what would benefit from cost-benefit analysis of the intervention. So is it the ex-offender? Is it the public? So in other words, on whose behalf is the cost-benefit being conducted? Is it a service provider? Is it the police? Is it the ex-offender? Well, it could be all three. It could be the public, or is it the public at large? And so when you're looking at those things, it's the same thing that happens with child care. When we do cost-benefit analysis of child care, is this a service to the public? Is it a service to the educational field? Is it a service to mothers? Is it a service to children, service to families, service to government? Depending on who the client actually is and who all the stakeholders are is very, very important for CBA. And that's why you often see, you know, somebody will come out and say, well, if they just did such and so, it'd save the government 9 times what they're spending now, and then you turn around and government isn't doing it. And well, I know from being years I was in government that you're always being told that something would be 10 times cheaper if you just did it a certain way. And your thought balloon is, well, but there's a public out there that doesn't want to do this. So we have to go back and rethink it. So the cost-benefit analysis actually isn't just the you're going to save 10 times what you paid. It has to take into account all the stakeholders in terms of that. And that's why I use the Ford Pinto example as a very sort of very available analysis of how you have to take all stakeholders into account. So we already know that there are members of the public who will say that the fact that there is one victim, even one victim of an offense committed during or after an intervention, means that the program does not work. When I say think Huckabee, I'm thinking, and I got the the URL there, is Mike Huckabee was governor, I think, of, I don't know, one of the southern states, it might have been Arkansas, who released one violent offender who went out and violently reoffended. And it had a real toll on his presidential campaign in just that one instance. And the reason people often think this is because it's cost, which is the one victim, and again, how do you put a price on a person? Those costs are too high a cost to pay. So doubtless the criteria for cost-benefit in terms of who benefits and who pays will be different for varying stakeholders. So one person would say one violent offender getting out and violently offending again, even though in Canada, I think there's something like 200 violent offenders who were paroled and then who violently offended while on parole. And there's a fellow by the name of Doob, D-O-O-B, at the University of Toronto who has pointed out that almost every single one of those 200 folks made the headlines of papers when it happened. So it's very, very available and very, very well known to the public that when you have violent offenders who violently reoffend when they haven't gone to warrant expiry, in other words, where they haven't served their whole term in prison where they would have got out anyways, and that's very important. So cost-benefit analysis is typically used by governments to evaluate the desirability of a given intervention. They're not just trying to figure out whether something costs less if you do it a particular way. That's part of it because people are going to say, where's the money going to come from? But even after they've asked where the money's going to come from, then they have the secondary questions as to whether this is something they want in the first place. And of course, when you get the one violent reoffender, many will say that the costs are too great. So cost-benefit is analysis of the cost-effectiveness of different alternatives in order to see whether the benefits outweigh the costs. So that's part of it. So it's its desirability, weighing different things that one could do, and the aim is to gauge the efficiency of the intervention relative to the status quo. So for that portion of the public that would say lock them up and throw away the key, which would effectively turn prisons into old age homes after a period of time, they have a certain point of view on this, and it certainly figures into that public acceptance across the board. So cost-benefit analysis attempts to put all relevant costs and benefits on a common footing, and this is the math part of it. A discount rate is chosen because the theory, of course, is that the money that you spend now is going to be worth less in the future. So if you think of what things used to cost 20 or 30 years ago, the amount that you're going to save is an amount in the future. So you choose a discount rate, and again, this is the math. It's then used to compute all relevant future costs and benefits in present value terms. So you have to compare apples to apples and Granny Smith to Granny Smith. So a 10-year time frame to assess cost benefit is likely reasonable, would be subject to debate because the world changes and so is everything going to remain the same. So you have to speculate in some senses about what the world's going to be like in 10 years or 40 years if you're doing something that's going to change the life of a young person, and then say if their life is so changed, then we're going down the road to rack and ruin versus you know, becoming a business owner. People often talk about that guy at the Second Cup, for example, who was homeless and then turned his life around. Well, his own particular cost-benefit numbers would go through the roof. But of course, there's always the regression to the mean. But we always like to use those examples. So here's another thing, relationships again. Face it, you've changed. The man I married would never subject his family to an annual cost-benefit analysis. And thus, humor is created because we bring in cost-benefit into the more human and everyday realm, and that's the stock and trade of the humorist. Cost-benefit analysis is used mainly to assess the monetary value of very large private and public sector projects, again because of the planning fallacy, aspirational policy. Gee, we can put this up in 3 years. We can do everything in a short period of time. It's only going to cost a small amount of money, like you got things like the gun registry, for example, that when Alan Rock first talked about it was only going to cost $2 million, you know, and $100 million later, you still don't have one. Again, in aspirational terms, policy always looks easy to do, and in realistic terms, the cost-benefit analysis is there to try and to put it, you know, to put some realism into it. And this because such projects tend to include costs and benefits that are less amenable to being expressed in financial or monetary terms. For example, environmental damage. Well, how much does that really cost? We're seeing more and more these things that are not easily put into dollar terms. You know, that you'll say, well, gridlock costs, gridlock on the 401 costs Torontonians however many millions per year, and that would be using cost-benefit tools to do that. So the accuracy of the outcome of a cost-benefit analysis depends on how accurately the costs and the benefits have actually been estimated. What are the real costs? What are the real benefits? And of course, substitution effects. Well, you know, if you just consider it lost time while you're sitting in your car in gridlock, yet somebody might be learning a new language that they would have done at home anyway through CDs. I mean, so those sort of thing could probably dampen the cost. So what assumptions you make are very, very important. And CBA is typically used by governments to evaluate the desirability of a given intervention. So we're not just talking about the dollars and cents. It's an analysis of the cost effectiveness of different alternatives in order to see whether the benefits outweigh the costs. The aim is, again, to gauge the efficiency of the intervention relative to the status quo. And if you've seen that slide before, I think you have. So let's look, what are the goals of the cost-benefit analysis for intervention with ex-offenders? So why do we incarcerate people in the first place? This is what we have to do when we look at this narrative or paradigm for CBA with the possibility of release outcomes. For example, there's 4 things we could do, and for some reason in this chart I couldn't get the numbering system, so everything looks like number 1. So that's I'll improve my PowerPoint skills at some point. Anyways, we generally speaking, we incarcerate people for 4 reasons. We incarcerate them to rehabilitate them, to deter them, for society's protection, which is always the big one with the public, and retribution. So it's society's revenge, society's protection, to keep somebody from doing something, and then to help them to get better. So transitional supports on release, in other words, housing for the homeless and the supports they would get, it's easy to prove a benefit for rehabilitation, easy to prove the benefit for deterrence, easy to prove lower recidivism for society's protection. But in terms of retribution, if you put somebody in housing, most people will say, well, gee, it's not seen as a tough approach. So when you're advising somebody after doing a CBA, you would want to say that in order to meet the retribution goals of incarceration, you'd have to have a tough program. And in many cases, that's exactly what some of the people who work with ex-offenders, they actually bill the program as a tough program to be part of. Often even people who are warrant expiry, in other words, that they're completely through their sentence, could be faced with going back to jail or prison or incarceration of some sort if they don't get with the program. So if there's no supports on release, it's easy to prove cost in terms of recidivism. It's easy to prove cost in terms of deterrence. It's also with society's protection. But again, when it comes to retribution, if you have absolutely no supports, the individual would have to do it on their own, so there wouldn't be any upfront cost. But we also know that ex-offenders who don't get housed, especially amongst the homeless ex-offender, that they end up going through the criminal justice system about 8.5 times, and that's hugely, hugely expensive. And of course, that's what you would put into a cost-benefit analysis to as part of the calculation. So let's think about who accepts it and who rejects it. Since cost-benefit analysis is so important to having full public, or at least most public instance, before something's going to get done. Let's think about who accepts and rejects cost-benefit analysis. So here the cartoon, the result of your cost-benefit analysis, and it says you should have retired 4 years ago. Ha ha ha, again bringing CBA into real-life situations. So good cost-benefit analysis, so now we've put an adjective here, good. Good cost-benefit analysis takes all stakeholders, including the public interest, into account. And the Ford Pinto cost-benefit analysis was not good analysis because it did not take all relevant stakeholders into account and eventually failed in its conclusions because it wasn't a good cost-benefit analysis. But if a cost-benefit analysis only took key stakeholders into account, the result would definitely show a cost-benefit, but it would not take all elements of the public into account, and therefore would eventually fail. So it must take most into account. We have to take all stakeholders into account in some way. As we'll see in a minute, we don't necessarily have to get everyone. So who rejects positive cost-benefit analysis? Well, the people who believe that the people who are going to get the intervention are basically children of a lesser God. So you get from Million Dollar Murray, and here's a quote. This is to the mayor of Denver, who said, there are still people who stop me going into the supermarket and say, I can't believe you're going to help those homeless people, those bums. So the person who says that has already decided that the object of the intervention, who is going to be the homeless person, is not a person who deserves to get the intervention in the first place. That person, you know, you do all the cost-benefit analysis in the world, and they think that the recipient of the actual intervention is not worth it. So the frame used is that the services the mayor proposed were not for the public, but for a particular group of people who they had already concluded were unworthy of help. Once a public stakeholder, and in this case certain members of the public in Denver in this particular article, sees the benefit of spending to accrue to an unworthy party, and in that sense all discussion of cost-benefit is foreclosed. There's nothing possible you can say, just as there's nothing possible you can say to the person who says if one violent reoffender could reoffend again, then you can never do this because you can never give somebody parole, you can never provide them with housing and supports because of the possibility that one person could reoffend. So from the point of view of that person, the only benefit is going to the person that is being helped. And this person is someone who will remain unworthy. So you can see how you need to reframe the cost-benefit analysis to see the public, the general public, and other members of the public as the key stakeholder, not the person or persons who are going to be the direct recipient of the intervention. So for that person, there can be no cost-benefit as there's no service to the public. For this member of the public, cost-benefit analysis, supports, and housing must fail because they don't see any benefit going to them. They see the benefit only go to somebody who they've already decided is unworthy. So those members of the public who have concluded that they or their community may suffer from the presence of ex-offenders, that's the NIMBY phenomenon, will also reject the positive cost-benefit analysis. So it doesn't matter whether it's going to save 20 to 1 and maybe they don't have to pay any more taxes for the rest of their life. They still don't want them there. They've already concluded that cost-benefit analysis can't work. In other words, they reject the whole idea behind it. And they conclude that intervention delivered to someone who they consider unworthy of help, and that the presence of the ex-offender necessarily degrades the community and perhaps the value of their property. So you can see where I'm going here is by saying that they see the object of the intervention to be the cost-benefit analysis is applying to the person to whom the intervention applies, as opposed to seeing it as the whole of the society, which is what the cost-benefit analysis is attempting to do. But if you have too many within the public stakeholders who are either strong advocates or people who are, you know, who have enough support within their communities to reject it, then the best actual cost-benefit numbers, the metrics themselves, are not going to make any difference. And the cost-benefit of supports and housing cannot survive in the context that they accept, and that's why reframing is so important. And for them, interventions can never be less expensive and better than its alternatives, because if they've already decided that property values are going down because somebody in the neighborhood is going to be an ex-offender, then that's sort of their view of things. That's not something that's done on the basis of any study. It's what once again, it's aspirational policy. It's like saying, well, here's what I think will happen if we have people living in our community that who are ex-offenders. So, big surprise, that cost-benefit analysis cost us more than any benefit we've ever gotten from it. So again, that's one of the areas of humor explored by cost-benefit analysis. And that's saying, well, if they just paid us the money, I think probably the best expression of it comes from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid when they were Paul Newman and Robert Redford. This is back in the 1968 movie where had all these guys coming after them trying to catch them that were cracked, who were very, very good trackers. And he said, well, if they just paid us the money that they're paying them to get those guys, get us to stop robbing them, we'd stop robbing them. So once again, that's part of the frustration of cost-benefit analysis when they cost a lot of money. So let's think about cost-benefit analysis in the public interest. In most cost-benefit analysis where the eventual goal is to ask governments to implement cost-effective and better services, and I can't emphasize this enough, the intervention desired must be one that is conceived to be in the public interest. So we must frame supports in housing as interventions intended to be in the public interest. We're not just talking about we should have housing that goes to those people who are the actual recipients of the service. We can't conceive the intervention as help for the ex-offenders alone, or we begin to accept the frame of the members of the public in Gladwell's story about the $1 Million Murray. So I can't believe you're giving that money to those people who don't deserve it. So we have to think about the public interest, and that's what cost-benefit analysis is all about. We start making the same flaw. In other words, if we start thinking that way, as the Ford Motor Company did when it did its risk analysis of the Ford Pinto. So the $1 Million Murray example of public response to intervention replicates the same problem that we saw in the Ford Pinto case. Now that might be a bit of a stretch, but it actually does, because they conceive of their personal corporate interests as being more important than the public interest. And of course, that's when you have stakeholders in the process, they're always going to see their own private interests as trumping the public interest. And so as a public, if you are performing a cost-benefit analysis, you take the stakeholders into account, but you often have to take them into account as an externality, as opposed to part of the cost-benefit analysis. You know they're going to be against having certain people in their community, but then you have to think about, but when you do the cost-benefit analysis, you always got to be thinking of the public interest, and they're part of the public interest, but they're not all of the public interest. So rejecting the fundamental premise that the intervention could be conceived as being a service to the public. So that's what, of course, everybody who is trying to bring in housing for the homeless and for ex-offenders would be saying, hey, look, this is really a benefit not just to the person that it's being applied to, but it's also a benefit for the whole community at large, because then it might not be in front of your door, but it might be someone else's door that you have a homeless person who could benefit from housing and supports. So, but then again, to the person who cries NIMBY, the intervention has already been conceived as a service to persons other than themselves, and the benefit can only accrue to the ex-offender. That's very important. So let's think about the issue of giving. If the community is the recipient, and that's what we're always saying in cost-benefit analysis, remember, every stakeholder, then the community is giving to itself when it provides support and housing. If it's conceived as giving to an individual, then the main result must be that only the individual benefits and individual members of the public are removed from the intervention. Remember the guy walking up to the mayor of Denver in the supermarket saying, well, why do you want to give money to those people? Which, of course, he doesn't. in a way, that's taking a particular frame, and you need to reframe that when you're doing cost-benefit analysis and providing, and that's the importance of the narrative of cost-benefit analysis. And then inevitably, intervention will be seen by some as help for people who don't deserve it, as we've said. So in red, all the cost-benefit analysis in the world cannot change that perception unless the programs themselves are reframed to be seen as interventions other than help for the undeserving. In other words, we're helping all of us when we help people get into housing and get the supports that they need. So in order to do good cost-benefit analysis, we must see the intervention as first and foremost implemented on behalf of the public at large, a public that includes all of us. And again, the same mistake that the Ford Pinto cost-benefit analysis, which really isn't a cost-benefit analysis, but they call it one, was really a risk assessment and a business case that didn't include everybody. So if the intervention is conceived as intervention on behalf of the public, i.e. a public service like a utility, then the beneficiary is the community itself. Deservedness is really a question of whether the community, not the person, deserves to be safe. So yes, the person will be safer in housing and with the proper supports, but the community would also be framed as being deserving of safety, deserves another functioning member, deserves to have lower costs, and deserves to have a lower incidence of crime, because we know people who are homeless. If you take the denominator of the homeless ex-offender, then we know they're going to go through the system on an average 8.5 times, because that's just what the stats show us. So the cost-benefit analysis concerns itself with the question of whether the intervention achieves these goals, not the goals of actually providing the service itself. We're not centered on the service. So another cost-benefit analysis. This is a cartoon, I think, from Asia or India. So the guy saying, as an excuse after cost-benefit analysis, I concluded that the overhead costs were steadily increasing and there wasn't enough return on an investment, so project was terminated. And then, of course, the other guy says, "Seen, she ditched you," and humor is created once again. Oh. So key finding, intervention does not increase or decrease punishment or societal retribution towards an ex-offender. Intervention increases the responsibility of the ex-offender to take action to keep from reoffending, because otherwise, if the person is not in the housing, is usually a condition of release. And so you're actually putting more responsibility on the ex-offender than less responsibility, even though that the public would see it as putting less responsibility because they'd be out in the community as opposed to being in the slammer where it's supposedly less desirable to be there. So the public will not accept cost-benefit analysis on behalf of limited sector stakeholders, almost always. So why do we have so many cost-benefit analyses that talk about ex-offenders, how many that talk about the homeless, and the return on investment would be 8 times, 9 times, 10 times, but the public will not accept cost CBA on behalf of very limited stakeholders, like ex-offenders, like agencies, like the police, like the courts, like housing providers, or workers in the system. The public, though, will accept cost-benefit analysis. It fairly takes all stakeholders into account. For example, most people reading the Ford Pinto thing said, well, what about the guy who's about to get killed by the car? You know, everybody gets that right away. For example, if you talk about the cost-benefit taking into account civil society, neighborhood groups in which the ex-offender resides, what about them? Victims of crime, ex-offenders, agencies, police, courts, providers, and workers. Of course, there now we have everybody, and that's the proper frame for CBA. So the portion of the public that sees ex-offenders as criminals and the benefit of housing and transitional supports accruing to others, for example, just to the ex-offenders and the service providers, making it easier for a worker in the system to provide service, then they don't see a community benefit that includes them. And if you uninclude them, i.e. you exclude them, then they'll not accept the cost-benefit analysis. So in Canada and Ontario, all levels of government spend money on crime prevention, rehab, deterrence, protection of society, and punishment. So one of the real one of the real problems with CBA is, of course, it just talks about how much governments are going to save. It doesn't talk about which government. And of course, we have the problem that if the municipality spends money in the homelessness area, then the federal government's going to save the money by not having people in prison, and or the provincial government might save on people who are convicted of provincial offenses. So spending overlaps in many cases, and all three levels of government spend money on policing and incarceration. So all three levels spend money on homelessness also. So what's the issue? It's important for governments to understand how their expenditure from one cost center may or may not result in savings for another. I've heard municipal councilors, for example, say, well, if we're just going to spend money and it's going to save another government money, then they're not going to do it. So they're reluctant to approve spending that will result in savings that accrues to another level of government. Where one level of government reduces its funding, other levels suspect that the reduction is because of their spending. See, an example, federal changes to toughen sentencing for major criminal offenses have resulted in claims that other levels of government, i.e. municipalities and the province, will incur increased costs. So the cost benefit of support and housing to homeless likely is to accrue most to cities and provinces in that respect. Approximately $350 million is spent on homelessness in Ontario. In Toronto, that can be allocated $40 million by the City of Toronto and about equal shares by the federal government and the Ontario government. But of the three shares, the federal spending is diminishing over time. And cities and provinces are most likely to reap the highest benefit as medical costs, incarceration, and shelters are administered and funded at the provincial and local level. Estimates of the cost of eradicating homelessness range from $3 billion, while the benefits are estimated as high as $6 billion for the homeless population and society as a whole. Another joke. So what we have is the problem of having different pockets on the same pair of pants. I mean, in many ways, there's one taxpayer, and one taxpayer paying for everything. It's all of us. But regardless of the metrics, the political and societal urgency of dealing with either homeless people, and Section 810 refers to people who have gone warrant expiry. In other words, they have never been allowed parole throughout their whole process. They're in jeopardy, and that's Section 810 of the Criminal Code. For those who are interested in following it up, you can just put S810, and you'll come up with a whole a definition of that and the issue of peace bonds that I won't get into here. But it may mean that municipal and provincial programs may save more federal dollars than provincial or municipal dollars, while in the case of the homeless, the opposite is more likely to be the case. So cost-benefit analysis that looks at the big picture regards the source of funding and the savings first and foremost as different pockets on the same pair of pants. So there's that real issue. So that's, you got to be very careful in the narrative of cost-benefit analysis to talk about the one taxpayer approach, or else you'll get into very good and meaningful things not being done because there's the feeling that another level of government will actually incur the savings while they're incurring the costs. So the efficacy of cost benefits should not be decided on the basis on which level of government spends or saves to prove or disprove cost benefit. It doesn't prove or disprove cost benefit. What it does do is simply talk about governments as a whole. So that's the lecture or the webinar for today. Here you have the coordinates for me and for Essential Skills Ontario. And I guess I would say that if you haven't already, I'm sure everybody's got it, but the whole idea between cost-benefit analysis being different from any of the other forms of cost effectiveness, risk analysis, business cases, etc., is that the entire all stakeholders must be taken into account, and that at the same time you're going to have problematic stakeholders who believe that any intervention that's being studied is only put in place for the person to which the intervention applies, as opposed to seeing it as an overall public service. So there we are. Where are we? 1:45 almost.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions here. So I invite people, if you do have a question, to just go into the question pane and write it, and I will try and make sure John gets to it. So John, first question here, this is from Nancy. Is the goal always or mainly to get the lowest cost for the highest benefit, or is there room for ending up at a high cost for high benefit?
There should never be a goal that's really gaming the cost-benefit analysis in the first place, to have a goal to try to get a very high benefit for a low cost. I mean, in the lore of cost-benefit analysis, you're not going to know any of that before you start, and you may, on the one hand, you should basically be objective and playing it as it lays, sort of thing. In other words, you do the whole cost-benefit analysis. You may find that the costs are actually higher than the benefits. It's often the case when you look at things that are showing a real cost-benefit in the U.S. and then you bring them to Canada, and they just don't show the same at all. And that often has to do with the incarceration rates in the States are so much greater than in Canada, that when you actually say, well, listen, if you have a particular type of intervention, then you're going to have a lot fewer incarcerations. And now when you bring it into Canada, you find out the person probably wouldn't have been incarcerated for something in the first instance, and therefore you can't count it. So you can't, you really should not be trying to do anything except to say, what is A, is there a cost benefit, and B, if there is, what is the multiple? It may be the case that you would say, look, we're going to spend $50 million on something, but it will accrue savings over time in present value of $40 million, and saying so the program might only cost you $10 million. So it's not that you want to ever have the only government policy you'd ever want to do is those that are going to save you money. And there might be certain things that you could do that will cost you a certain amount now, but actually cost you more later. One of the things that I'm always using as an example of something that doesn't show a cost benefit but we continue to do is end-of-life health care for the elderly. So you have people who are not in any cost benefit sense going to be contributing, and I mean capital C contributing. They're not going to be paying a lot more tax, etc. They're not going to be contributing to the public good as we normally conceive it, although they, obviously in their own families. But the cost of end-of-life health care doesn't show any cost benefit at all. It only shows cost, yet at the same time, we wouldn't even conceive for a second in a civil society to say that we're not going to provide end-of-life health care to people. So the test for public policy has very little to do with cost benefit. The test for public policy tends to be is what type of civil society do we have, and what are the things that we wish to support, and what are the things that are going to apply to all of us in a fair and equitable way, as opposed to saying, well, gee, if everybody was good, we wouldn't need locks on our doors and we wouldn't need police. Just how you count and discount these various things is very important. But the test for public policy it tends not to be cost-benefit analysis and whether you can save money or not save money for it. So I think if something saves 3 times its cost or 5 times its cost or 10 times its cost is not really going to get governments to stand up and take notice unless you've also talked about how the intervention serves the public interest and how most people in civil society are actually on board with the intervention once you've conceived it as a public benefit.
Okay, we have a question from Michael here. Is consideration of all stakeholders the main difference between cost-benefit analysis and social return on investment?
Social return on investment is sort of a hybrid of return on investment, and return on investment is simply what companies do in terms of trying to set profit margins on the products they sell. And of course, then the net of that would be called your return on investment. So the social return on investment becomes how many people did you convert into taxpayers, or people who are taking a lower consumption of the public purse, for example, would be considered those are the things that would really stand up in a social return on investment. But rather than saying it's the only one, I would say it's the key one, because in terms of what a cost-benefit analysis, it doesn't just take into account the intervention and what it will do for a particular public that's receiving, or a portion of the public that's receiving the particular intervention. So the SROI tends to be more of a business case than it does a true cost-benefit analysis. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, this one is from Desiree. I hope I'm saying your name right. Do you have any suggestions of where to find cost data to monetize the costs and benefits of an intervention?
I would, just in terms of monetizing the intervention, I think just look at the cost-benefit analysis literature. There's a number of books that have been written on it. You could even start. The Wikipedia thing is you know, like all Wikipedia things, is flawed, but it's not bad. It's a good place to start, and it's filled with footnotes of places that you can go. And again, monetizing of interventions is only works to the extent that you can actually build a good narrative to say to people that particular things you're trying to monetize. I'm always humored a bit by people who talk about the losses that you will have from a snowstorm. I mean, you have the cost of digging it out. That's one thing. But then saying, well, people lost so many hours, and the hours of time were worth so much money. For example, if people have a great view looking out their window, what is that's got to be worth something. So is there a benefit there? Monetizing is only as good as, one, the acceptability of the monetization to the public. In fact, can you convince people that you can monetize it? Like, can you monetize gridlock and really put those millions of dollars? Like, who really lost those millions? Whose pockets are the millions coming out of, et cetera? And I mean, there's a certain degree to which you can do that, because you can say that a trucker spends more time on the highway, spending more gas, all that sort of thing. But then when you're starting to monetize the person's time, then certain things about gridlock are taken into account. I mean, life gets in the way of practically everything. So when you look at cost-benefit and then compare it to the planning fallacy, in other words, aspirational policy, what we think we could get done if there was nothing in the way, you know, those two are very, very different things. So, I would try to stick with monetizing things that you can actually monetize easily. In other words, where you can actually show the cost of if you're talking about gridlock, where you're trying to show the extra cost of the gas, where you're trying to show the extra hours the person might work, the actual wear and tear on the truck going across the highway, carrying the goods from one place to another, the actual opportunity costs that were involved in terms of having something being late and late for sale, therefore somebody couldn't get it. Those are some of the things that you can monetize. But then, instead of trying to monetize the overall value of the person's time or the overall value, it can get into some things that are pretty airy-fairy and very hard to cost. So that would be my one admonition. Stick with the stuff that's easily monetizable, where you can actually put a price to something and be credible.
Okay, I'm trying to get to you a question from each person that's asking. How will cost-benefit evolve as governments seek more pay-for-success models like social impact bonds?
Well, I mean, social impact bond is a particular is a very interesting construct, because what it does is set out here's what we would normally expect. So, for example, if you have a social impact bond that's actually going to deal with ex-offenders, for example, you have to look at the metrics of what happens now, and then look at the actual impact of the intervention that's funded by the social impact bond, and then you're going to return to the investor from government the difference between, or some portion of the difference between, what it cost before and what it costs after. So I think governments will be looking at them very closely. Obviously, conservative governments look towards them as a way of actually reducing government expenditures and having them privatized. On the other hand, what if you have situations where the intervention doesn't necessarily work and it costs government more money? Are we really asking for the investor to take on the moral hazard of that risk? And I'm not sure that those particular questions have been worked out yet. And if I was in government now, I'd certainly say, well, are we going to pick up the tab when they don't work? Because in the business world, that's caveat emptor, right? Buyer beware. If you buy a stock and it goes down, who holds the loss? Well, you do. In the case of something that's normally funded by government, who's going to actually incur that cost? If it's and this was the whole debate in the crash of 2008 with these various corporations that created this sort of funny money. Then it all imploded, and then they wanted to be backed up by government. Well, the idea of moral hazard there is that if you know the government's going to back you up, you're going to be more reckless. And I just get the sense that if the government was going to back social impact bonds when they didn't work, then people are going to be more reckless in terms of what they're going to invest in the first place, because they know that they're not going to lose on the deal in the final analysis. That they can only go to to zero, that they wouldn't have to pay if it'd be like shorting the stock, so to speak. But yes, government is always going to say, as part of its narrative, that it's looking for things that are effective. But the part that I'm trying to give you is that that's not always what they're going to do, because governments are always going to provide end-of-life health care, and the reality is, is the cost-benefit of end-of-life health care it does not show cost-benefit. It is not cost-effective. But that's kind of irrelevant, and that's the point I'm trying to make to you. If it's not good public policy in the first place, government's not going to do it. They're going to ask whether something, they're not just going to go into aspirational policy and not temper it with cost-benefit analysis, business plans, and risk analyses. But at the same time, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to do something if it is cost-effective, and it doesn't mean that they're going to stop doing things that are not cost-effective. That's going to be those. In other words, the first decision is whether it's good public policy or not good public policy, and that the cost-effectiveness is something that's really, in the final analysis, a secondary concern. Whereas I think what people have started to think erroneously is that that people are looking for, or governments are looking for, cost-effectiveness first before they decide whether something's the right thing to do.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick one. In practice, are problematic stakeholders just given less weight in a cost-benefit analysis if they reject reframing of the intervention in terms of the greater good?
Yeah, I think it's the one those who completely reject cost-benefit analysis because they think the person or people to whom, or the programs to whom the benefits apply are children of a lesser god, so to speak. In the final analysis, you have to ignore them in the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, you can't politically ignore them because they can be very strong stakeholders that in the final analysis will prevent something from happening. But if somebody says, if even one slip-up, if a public policy doesn't actually reach perfection, in other words, that every ex-offender put on, or every offender who is placed on parole, if the test is that not one of them can reoffend, or else it's a failure, then obviously that cannot be considered in any cost-benefit analysis. That's more of a political consideration in terms of the first principles of public policy making. But again, in the case of the ex-offender analysis, is that 97% of all offenders get out of prison, and even if you were to double the amount that you threw away the key, you'd still have 94% getting out, because you go from 97 to 94, and that 3% got out before, 6% now, so that would be the doubling. But at the same time, you're still beset with the exact same problem in terms of the societal issue. You've just turned a few more prisons into old age homes, and of course, that's what they found in the U.S.
Okay, I'll have to leave it there. It's after 2 now. Sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions and comments, but thank you everyone for attending, and keep looking for future webinars from Essential Skills Ontario, and thank you to John for not just this webinar, but all the ones he's done for us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Bye now.